Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold. So glad to be with you today. You know, I wonder exactly what the statistics are of the number of kids that are using cannabis today. Now, I don't know exactly what those numbers are, but I'm going to find out because my guest today is Dr. Gary Kirkilas, and he is a Phoenix-based physician, and he knows a lot about it. Gary, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'm really curious, the percentage, you probably know these numbers, but how many kids are involved in using cannabis today? Or I know there's a lot of other names for it, but let's start with cannabis.
Yeah. So there's some good news and there's some bad news. Currently, around 18 to 20% of our high schoolers are using cannabis, and either they're smoking it or they're eating it as gummies. That number could be considered good or bad. If you look back to the 70s, that number was really high. About more than 50% of high schoolers were using cannabis, marijuana. And that number declined until the 90s. We saw it uptick up to about 30%.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, it declined. And right around the pandemic, around 2020, 2021, it really shot down. And now we're at 18%. So it's good that we see these numbers dropping. However, I still would like it to be much lower. I mean, 18%, that's a pretty good chunk of our high schoolers that are using it. And I know we could probably drop this down more, because when we look at, other things like cigarette smoking, like maybe 2 or 3% of our high schoolers are using traditional cigarettes. So I know it's possible to get this number down, but yeah, to answer your question, just around 18% to 20% of our high schoolers are using cannabis.
And Gary, at what age are they starting to use it?
For some, it's quite varied. But we typically see around 8th grade is when they're getting their first initiations to it, and that could either be from an older sibling that's in high school. That could be getting into their parents. Many parents are now using cannabis gummies for sleep and such. So it's a variety, but right around 8th grade is when we're seeing most kids getting either offered it or using it for the first time.
Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest. If you just joined us, we're talking about cannabis use today. And Gary, I'm so interested about the legalization of cannabis. What are and have been the ramifications so far about legalizing it?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of data. People are trying to figure out whether legalizing cannabis makes it is it driving up numbers of youth using it? And for the most part, our numbers have been steady. A lot of states legalized it in the late teens to the 2020s, and our numbers have been dropping or staying the same. So that's one debatable effect of legalization. The other thing, though, now when we have legalization, a lot of commercialization is able to produce products like vape pens and gummies, and that we definitely have seen increased numbers. So depending on where you are, if you are in a state that has legalized, I can almost guarantee you that your poison control percent of number of calls that they're fielding due to kids getting into gummies or teenagers getting into gummies is about up by like 200%. So a lot of these kids are coming in with these high dose encounters with cannabis. So that's kind of an unfortunate thing that we see as a result of legalization. The other thing that we're seeing that we've never seen before is the advertisements of such. So whereas before, when cannabis was illegal in most states, you simply would not see billboards or social media posts. But now that these businesses are free to practice their business, and as most businesses want to advertise, we're now seeing advertisements. And some of them have been targeting children, which is unfortunate as well.
Well, the advertising topic is very interesting because I think at some point they had to take the Joe Camel away because it was this cartoonish character that was kids found interesting. So I'm curious as to how they're marketing cannabis. And when you have it in a friendly little gummy bear, that doesn't sound too harmful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in the late 90s, that's the last time anybody saw any billboards of tobacco products. That's the last time you saw any cartoons, billboards in your schools or your college campuses. And we learned our lesson. And as a result, if you look at all the data, high schoolers are not smoking cigarettes just because we got rid of the advertising. Made it no longer appealing to youth, and we no longer allow the tobacco companies to target using cartoons, which is really silly when you think about it. I mean, if you have to be 18 back then to purchase tobacco products, why would you ever use a cartoon? Unfortunately, though, now that cannabis is legal, we have none of those protections. Some states will have some very weak laws, protecting them, protecting children, but others don't. For instance, like maybe 30% of the states that have legalized cannabis will have something on the books that says you can't use cartoons. So it's very sad state of affairs. And I've helped several states like Hawaii and Virginia, kind of speaking with lawmakers and helping them figure out that we shouldn't be targeting youth. This is our youth really need to be protected in a sense.
Gary, I'm going to sound very uninformed right now, but tell me how easy is it to get gummies? Do you go to a department store? I mean, a store like Walmart or Target, or can you just buy gummies there now? How do you get gummies?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So most states that have legalized cannabis use, most of the time, or I should say all the time, those products can only be dispensed in a licensed facility that's usually regulated by some sort of Department of Commerce or by the Department of Health. So ideally, the only place someone would be able to get these products would be from a licensed dispensary, in which they have to, card people who come in, and hopefully steer away any underage use. However, there is still a black market, so people are getting things purchased on the internet. You can find what they call plugs, which are basically people who are selling these products on Instagram and other social media devices. And then you get people who are 21 who are now selling it, turning around and selling it to kids who are in high school. So that's the majority of what is happening. I will say though that, and this is a bit complicated. So marijuana, cannabis, the main component is called THC, and that's the psychoactive component. You can, however, make THC in a lab, which would be called Delta 8. And that is kind of fuzzy because in some states, it falls under the idea that it is hemp, and hemp is essentially not the non-psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. And in some states, you can find that being sold in gas stations, which makes it is more concerning because obviously in a dispensary that's being under the microscope of the Department of Health, they're going to make sure that kids aren't under 21 when they come in. However, gas stations, that's a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Gary, when I think and hear stories of kids that are dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety, so they're looking for ways to change how they feel, whether it's going to be with food or experimenting with drugs, it seems that gummy bear cannabis could be something that would be an easy way to get your hands on something. So when we talk about the advertising of cannabis, how do the parents and grandparents start to look for signs that their child, their grandchild, might be starting to use cannabis?
That's another good question. So, and it's hard as parents and as grandparents, as caretakers, to know what's normal behavior and what's not normal behavior. Certainly, if you see a big change where your child is no longer participating in sports, no longer wants to partake in things that they normally used to like to do, hobbies, etc. Their friends perhaps have changed. They're being more elusive about where they're going, who their friends are, not wanting to open up. That might be signs that that they're experiencing some sort of mental health issue like depression or anxiety, and then B, they're self-medicating with products like cannabis or alcohol. It's really difficult though, because most teenagers, it's an awkward time of life, right? You got one foot in childhood, one foot in adulthood, and it's hard to make sense of the world. You're struggling for freedom, and you're really prone to social pressures and wanting to fit in. So some of this is just normal behavior. However, if you see large changes, that would be concerning. And I recommend to parents just have an honest conversation. Try not to be so much of a disciplinarian. Try to get information from them. Be firm. Obviously, you don't want to condone any bad behavior, but really try to open up that line of communication about what's going on mentally, how they feeling, and what are they doing. Because as you mentioned, it's a very easy way. I mean, that's, you talk to most people who are abusing alcohol. I mean, they're doing it for a specific reason because they're depressed or anxious or some sort of life trauma. They want to bury it. And that's most of my patients when I talk to them about when they're using cannabis. I'll get the kids that use it on the weekends and they basically use it as a social lubricant. But a lot of them are just stressed and anxious and depressed. And they basically just want to bury that stuff by using cannabis. And I tell them that's, yes, it works in the short term because now you don't feel depressed or anxious anymore, but you still have your problem there waiting for you once you're done. And that makes you want to use it all the time. And then you have two problems. You have your mental health issue, plus now you're using cannabis, multiple times a day. And now you have two problems.
Mm-hmm. Gary, I don't know, is cannabis legal in all 50 states?
No, I think it's around 24. Numbers always changing because I think in 2024 we had, I think, 3 or 4 additional states, so it might be somewhere around the 24-ish to 30-ish.
Okay.
I'll have to double check.
And do you see it heading that direction of having more and more states coming on board with legalizing cannabis?
Yes, when people are polled about whether they feel like cannabis should be illegal, most polls are showing that yes, they would prefer it to be legal. Now there's a lot of details packed in that answer because one, most people are answering that question based on their experience of what cannabis was like in the 70s and 80s, in which it was 2 to 3% THC, produced mild euphoria. They think, what's the big deal? Why should anybody be incarcerated for that? Let's make it legal. Unfortunately, though, that's not the reality. The stuff that's being sold in dispensaries now is not that 2 to 3% THC. It's like 30%. So it's supercharged marijuana. And then you have things like gummies. And then they also sell like resin, which is pure THC. So it's kind of like this really supercharged stuff. So I don't think people realize that that's what's going on. Secondly, a lot of times they'll say, yes, they feel like it should be legal, but they don't necessarily want that dispensary in their neighborhood. So it's packed a little in there. So I do see more additional states making it legal, which is, in my opinion, worrisome because then I know once it's legal, then you're going to get the advertising, you're going to get the gummies, kids are going to get their hands on it more.
Mm-hmm. When I hear about the legalization of cannabis, usually what goes on in my head is it for recreation? Is it a recreational component or a medicinal component? And most of the time in my head, I'm thinking you're pushing for a recreational component. Am I right or wrong on that?
Yeah, I mean, most states will follow a path of, they'll say, we need something for our veterans. We need something for people who have, end-stage cancer. We need medicinal use. And so it becomes legalized. I don't know how genuine people are when they're doing that. I'm a pediatrician. I don't want to stand in the way of someone who has cancer or someone who has major life traumas that they feel this is useful. However, it just seems a little eerie that every state that has gone through the route of making it medicinally legal then follows suit within a couple of years of making it recreationally legal. And that's where the lion's share of use is coming from. So I think this might be financially motivated, where it's sort of a game plan where we introduce it as medicinal use. Those people, the small select number of people who have reasons to use it will use it. And then comes the financial decision of making it recreationally legal. And that's where the lion's share of use comes from and revenue as well.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest. We're talking about cannabis and the ramifications of legalizing it and the percentage of kids that are using it. We're going to take a little break and come back with Gary, but if you have a question or comment, you are welcome to text it over 877-933-2484. Again, 877-933-2484. Well, it seems like just yesterday there was a presidential election. You believe it's been 4 years, and here we are again. And of course, there's some tension, there's some anxiety, and we need to be joined together in prayer and in unity for peace and for God's will to be done in this oftentimes fearful and divided time in our country. If you want to head over to myfaithradio.com and text the word vote to 877-933-2484, you can get an election prayer guide. I'm with Dr. Gary Kirkilas today. We're talking about the legalization of cannabis and the ways in which kids are getting access to it and some of the issues that they are facing. Gary, I'd love to go back to talk about the issues that we're facing when it comes to the advertising of it, because I think this is so significant. Kids get this, they see it on social media, they see it on the internet, they see it all over the place, and boy, their brains just go, well, I want to try this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you a good example is to take a look at tobacco products. So, prior to them advertising tobacco, so of course, some people were smoking, guys in bowling alleys, sailors, things like that. But it was kind of viewed as kind of an older man's habit, kind of a rough habit.
Mm-hmm.
But once advertising got into play, you started seeing famous movie stars. You started seeing them target youth. You started seeing cartoons popping up. You started seeing flavors added, advertising near college campuses, and it exploded. I mean, it went from a very small population using tobacco to it exploding to you smoked on airplanes, doctors smoked, in your boardroom meetings, everyone was smoking. It was basically written into labor laws. It was all because it was advertised so well. And so you're right to say this is very concerning because if we have, like as we talked at the top of the hour, about 18% of high schoolers using it, if we start seeing an influx of advertising on billboards, social media, and they use the same sort of playbook that the tobacco industry use, we can only expect the same thing's going to happen where youth are going to be using it more. And in my opinion, I think it's sort of already happening. When I have a young person in my exam room and I ask them, I say, "Hey, are you using fentanyl or methamphetamines or cocaine?" They'll say, "Oh, doctor, of course not. That's horrible. Those are bad drugs. Why would anyone want to do that?" However, when I ask them about cannabis, it's a completely different story. They say, "Oh, well, yeah, I use it. It helps me with my social anxiety, or I'm depressed and this stuff helps me, or I can't sleep and this is the only way I could sleep." Most kids see this as a very benign thing. And I think it's multifactorial, but I think a lot of it comes from the fact that one, it's legal. So how bad could it be if it's something that's legal? Two, if it's being advertised and the people are using cartoons, how bad could it be? It's something that's normal. And that's all quite dangerous because the opposite is true. I mean, the more research we do, we find out that people who are using cannabis, especially who are using it daily or using high potency THC, it's having major effects on their brain. And brains don't finish developing until you're like 23. So they can do a lot of damage in that time.
Speaking of the use of cigarettes, I remember tuning into a news broadcast, and the news broadcaster would be having a cigarette in the ashtray, and I'm going, mm-hmm. This is a different day, different time. Talk show hosts at night, they were smoking.
Yeah, it did, and I hope we don't get to that point. I don't think we will.
I hope we don't.
I do think we'll. Yeah, I do think though. Oh, I mean, maybe I should take that back because I remember some video podcasts where I saw people that were smoking joints, and I was like, huh, that kind of reminds me of those 50s, 60s news broadcasts where you had someone smoking. So yeah, maybe history is repeating itself, but I sure hope that it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Gary, talk about the difference in cannabis from the 1970s, obviously, to today. Are we dealing with essentially the same product? Is it a very different product? And what should we know about it today?
Yeah, and that's something that we don't talk about enough. It is definitely a different product. The cannabis plant that was available in the 60s and 70s had about a 2 to 3% content of THC. And if you used it, you probably had a mild sense of euphoria that might have lasted 1-2 hours. And most people are making decisions based on that idea of the product. So they compare that with alcohol and they say, well, what's the big difference? I wish that was true, but in true, Western industrial commercialization, we want it faster and we want it bigger and more powerful. And as a result, many of the strains of the cannabis plant have been bred specifically to have higher contents of THC. So now the average THC content will be 30%. And that's when you're smoking the actual bud flower of the plant. Then what they do is they use an extraction process in which they remove all the THC out of the plant material and they make a resin or like a viscous fluid, and they put that and they make that gummies out of that, or they can just concentrate it even more and make basically pure THC. And the results are devastating. I mean, we in the emergency room, we'll have kids coming in who are completely intoxicated on this stuff. They've been completely overloaded, and that can happen to young people. That can happen to teenagers, and it's having effects on both on their immediate sense on their bodies as well as their brain. Another thing that happens too is back in the 60s, 70s, if you were to use cannabis, you would have to smoke a joint and you would know exactly what you were doing. You could smell it, you could taste it. There was no denying what you were doing. However, nowadays, if you put that same THC content into let's say, a candy apple or sour peach gummy bear,
Mm-hmm.
you could take one or two of those and it tastes like candy. So you really don't know what you're doing. And we get a lot of teens that come in and they say, well, I took two or three, I didn't feel anything. So I took two or three more, and then now they're intoxicated.
Wow.
So it's very easy to get yourself into trouble because now there's flavors and colors and tastes to kind of hide what you're doing and getting kids in trouble.
Gary, as a physician, maybe you would talk about what is happening to people's brains, kids' brains, when they are abusing gummies and cannabis.
Yeah, so we previously thought that around 17, 18, 19, the frontal cortex of someone's brain, the decision making or your impulse control section was done developing. You're 18, you can vote, you can go into the military service. There was just this false idea that at 18 the brain is done developing, but in reality the brain doesn't end up developing until the age of like 21, 22, 23, and that makes sense. I mean, if anyone has any contact with a teenager, they can be quite irrational, making very
Mm-hmm.
outlandish decisions, right? Well, there's a reason for that. It's because their brain hasn't finished developing, specifically in the parts that control impulse control. The decision to mouth off to a parent or a teacher, that's not fully developed yet. We have found that cannabis seems to have this association with impaired memory, impaired decision making, impaired impulse control, short-term memory. Even when we do functional MRI scans of their brains, it's very different than people who don't use cannabis. And this all bears out because when we look at the data, a lot of these kids who are using cannabis regularly, they have higher rates of absenteeism, poor rates of high school completion, and it's really hurting our society as a whole.
Gary, give us a little overview of what a kid's state of mind is going to be after 4 or 5 gummy bears behind the wheel of a car.
Yeah, I mean, we all have been well versed in understanding that you cannot drink and drive, right?
Oh,
This
yeah.
delayed impulse control, right? And again, for whatever reason, cannabis is sort of in this limelight where it's considered medicine and completely benign. But when you're taking this high dose cannabis, especially when you're taking multiple of these, the digestion rate. So typically, if you were to smoke cannabis, you would feel the effects much sooner. Edibles take a little bit longer, and that's where kids get themselves in trouble. So you have a teenager who's eaten 4 or 5 of these cannabis gummies. They have decreased reaction time, and so it would be no different for them as someone who was inebriated on alcohol or any substance. They are not fit to drive a vehicle, and they can get themselves in a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this obviously is a problem that is not going away, and especially if they succeed in their advertising programs to make it more and more available and capture kids' attention and imagination, they're going to get their hands on it. Is it a gateway drug as well?
That's a really tough question to answer, and it's hard to answer because it's how do you figure out whether that person was going to go down the long
That's true.
line of using cannabis and then to fentanyl other things? So it's really hard as a physician to kind of say yes or no to that. But I think sort of the easier way to look at it is why have it available? Why have this something to even if it does exist as a gateway to using harder drugs? Why even have it available? Sometimes we'll also get the question of, well, I would rather have my son using cannabis than smoking crack, or I'd rather have them using this more than using fentanyl. Yeah, I don't like to kind of play that game because it's like, you have two bad things. Why should we
Right.
settle for the one that's less worse,
Right.
right? How about we just have kids who are healthy and making good decisions? Yes, they're probably going to experiment at some point, and maybe not. But I would rather them not use it, not have it available to them. And yeah, I mean, smoking is a bad habit. It has bad effects on our lungs. We don't want to put anything in our bodies that affect our brain and our development. So yeah.
Gary, is cannabis the most widely cultivated and trafficked and abused illicit drug today?
I don't know. Off the cuff, I would probably have to say it would probably be fentanyl. That's
Okay.
sort of flooding our markets. Very cheap to make. It essentially is everywhere. Very easy to transport across the border. So I probably would probably point to fentanyl. But to say which specifically, I don't know. But if I had to guess, I'd probably say fentanyl.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest as we're talking about cannabis and the legalization of it and the way in which kids are getting their hands on it. And there is a growing percentage of kids that are starting to use it. And if you have a question or comment for Dr. Kirkilas, you can text it over 877-933-2484. Again, 877-933-2484. We always have to be praying for our kids, don't we? We just want to make sure that they are healthy and strong and that they're grounded in their relationship with the Lord and that they're not looking for something to prop up their depression or their self-esteem, that they can be confident in who they are. We'll be right back.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest today. He's a pediatrician in the Phoenix area. We're talking about cannabis, the legalization of it, and the effects it has on kids. But Gary, a question just popped up about the effects. Let's see, where'd that go? The effects of cannabis on adults, if they're older.
Yeah, it's a hard one for me as a pediatrician. Obviously, my focus is more on youth. But
Sure.
again, with smoking anything, I don't care if it is tobacco, cannabis, or a burning building, smoke that is not intended to be in your lungs. So the more habitual someone is smoking and exposing their lung tissue to smoke, the worse off they are. We see things like cancer, COPD, emphysema. Your lung tissue is some of the most sensitive tissue, and if you're a habitual cannabis marijuana smoker, you are habitually injuring your lungs. Now, as far as other effects, as far as to the brain, I don't know if that's been as measured as much as in youth. I know there has been some studies that are showing that young adults have something called cannabis-induced psychosis, where there seems to be, it's multifactorial, so it's hard to create a direct line of causation, but it seems that people who may be prone or subject to things like schizophrenia or psychosis, cannabis is sort of helping that along. And where people who will come in after several days or months of high dose habitual use of cannabis come in with psychotic delusions, and as soon as they come off the cannabis, we see it dissipate. So it's one of those factors where we still need more research to figure out what's going on. But I will say there's been whole lot of cases, a lot of research is showing this some sort of causation, potential association with high dose cannabis and psychosis. And again, I want to emphasize the cannabis again that we have today is high percentage THC, so 30% up to 90%. The human body was never meant to encounter this much THC. It's completely different than the more quote unquote natural cannabis that was available in the 60s, 70s, which only had 2 to 3% THC.
Mm-hmm. Gary, another question came in as to how it affects children that are around people that are smoking it in their homes. I've seen it as a problem working in the school system where a child will come like they are half lit up because of their parents smoking it in their home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the sort of the colloquial term hot boxing or contact high, it exists. So if someone's who's smoking in a closed environment, anyone in that room will be able to inhale it and have that effects. Obviously, not to the extent of directly, perhaps smoking a joint. But yeah, if you're in the room with them, you're inhaling that and getting that THC into your body. So yes, it is quite a problem. And as I alluded to before, with more and more adults using things like gummies for sleep, if kids like things that are high colored and they like candy. They see a gummy laying around on a parent's nightstand. You can guarantee that's going in their mouth.
Yeah, that's scary. Another question that came in about and this is maybe not your wheelhouse quite so much, but a person in their 60s who goes from leaving alcohol addiction and then substituting THC drinks and gummies. It feels like they're in the same addictive behavior. Doesn't surprise me. I bet it doesn't surprise you either, does it?
No, I mean, a lot of times we'll have people that have some initial problem, whether it is depression, anxiety, a life trauma that they haven't gotten through. They'll use something to sort of sweep that under the rug. And I feel for them. It's not something I'm just saying this disparagingly. Life can be very difficult. Depression and anxiety are very, very real and can be very debilitating. And people will look to alcohol, or they might look to cannabis, and they're not using it recreationally, they're using it to bury things. So if you're always depressed or you're always anxious, then essentially you're going to have to always be using cannabis or alcohol to bury those feelings, and that's where people get themselves into trouble. And I know it's hard, but I always point people toward counseling, doing it the right way, where you're getting at the root of the problem, not covering it. Right? I know it's hard, talking about sensitive things with a counselor. It might seem a lot easier just to sort of make those feelings go away, but again, you're going to have two problems, and neither of them are going away until you really address it.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest. Gary, maybe you would give us some information about cannabis vaping. I know it's another way to get it into your system, but I don't know if I've ever put those two words together.
Yeah, so vaping came on the scene as a means to eliminate the combustion component of tobacco smoke. So companies like Juul and other producers essentially said, look, we know people are using cigarettes, they are addicted to nicotine, burning the tobacco leaf has a lot of carcinogens in it. If we can just vaporize the nicotine and have them directly inhale that, would that be better? So that those systems where they have liquid nicotine have been converted to now using liquid cannabis THC. So whereas someone could use a device to inhale nicotine, they are now using that same device to inhale THC, and it can be quite dangerous too, because again, when you're smoking a cigarette or you're smoking a joint, you know exactly what you're doing it. You can smell it. You can cough. It burns your throat. When you use a vape device, those vape devices don't have those same ill effects, right? You don't feel the burn. You don't smell the cannabis smell. And a lot of times they're flavored, and they're specifically flavoring them with things that they know young adults like. So you'll see candy flavors like sour apple or candy apple, sour peach, grape. To me, that's marketing toward youth, and it makes sense too, because if we know anything from the tobacco industry, they target youth because they want people to see their product as not dangerous, so that by the time they're of the age of purchase, they've already seen these advertisements and they don't have a strong perception of risk of use, meaning fancy words for saying they don't see this thing as dangerous. So when you use vape devices and you use those like flavors, you're hooking kids in. And again, it's I've talked to a lot of superintendents and principals, and they say they can't get these vape devices out of their schools because kids can use them when they're in the bathroom. They can use them before, and there's no exhaust to it, so they can't smell anything. And these kids are high during school, and that's why we see these decreased graduation rates. Is because how are kids supposed to learn their trigonometry or their American history if they're high because they were using a vape device in the boys' bathroom?
Yeah, great point. Is cannabis toxic in children?
Absolutely. I mean, it's toxic in everyone. I mean,
Okay.
your body does not need cannabis
No.
to survive. It's something
Okay.
that we're introducing, right? But yeah, absolutely. We get kids who, especially with the high dose frequent use, there's something called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, where they have it's quite complicated, but they have so much of this THC in their body that they have this unremitting vomiting, where they come into the emergency room and they're just vomiting incessantly. And it's really hard to treat because we don't really know too much about how to stop the sort of cycle where they're continually vomiting. So it definitely is toxic. Poison control calls are up 100, 200% in those places that have legalized cannabis.
Mm-hmm. Gary, what do educators K through 16, question that came in on the text line, what do educators and leaders say about personal spiritual development and wise lawmaking and relationships like family, neighbors, values, and virtues in schools and their lasting effects? How about affecting leadership skills?
So maybe is that question, I know it was a text question, but I get, maybe I'll address it this way. I definitely, if we want, as parents and caregivers and as teachers, we need to dispense information. Teenagers need to know what is available, what is out there, and why it's bad. And they don't need to be given sort of like a fear-based sort of lecture, especially when they're older, because kids will kind of see through that. They'll have a friend who's used cannabis or vaped cannabis, and they're okay, so they won't buy into that. But they definitely need to hear that this stuff is bad for them. That habitual use will eventually cause some major health defects, brain defects with their development. So we really need to be addressing this, because I can guarantee you, if spiritual leaders aren't talking about it, if educators are talking about it, if parents are talking about it, someone will talk to them about it, and that person's probably going to be their peer or a drug dealer.
Right.
So you want to be the first person to talk to them. And I tell parents, pick a time, maybe when you're driving a car. That way, you're not looking at them. It's more or less threatening, and just kind of talk about the topic. Your lead-in should never be, "Are you using drugs?" It should be more about the topic, because they'll get very defensive if you do that, and they'll clam up, and they'll perceive that they're going to get in trouble. You really don't want that. You really want to be able to talk to them and have that open line of communication, so that you can deliver that information.
So, Gary, you're encouraging parents to be proactive and talk to their kids about marijuana and its dangers, which is so smart.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, like when I'm in the car with my kids, I have 4 of them, and I see someone on the street on the corner who's smoking a cigarette, I'll point it out. I'll say, "Look at that person. That person's making a really bad decision. That smoke is going into their lungs, and it's harming their lungs. I feel bad for them. That's really unfortunate." So that they know that some people are making bad decisions, and they've heard what you're supposed to do and what is expected, and that's really important. And when we look at those kids who are abstaining from using, the numbers are increasing. So kids are receptive to hearing this, but they have to hear it first, and they have to hear it in a very non-judgmental, non-threatening way, where they can kind of perceive that you really care about them. You really want them to have the information. This isn't about getting them in trouble or getting them grounded. Do be firm. Let them know your expectations, that sort of behavior is not warranted or not allowed in the household, but give them that information nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest. Gary, talk a little bit, if you would, about how THC impacts the brain.
Yeah, so the on a sort of molecular level, we don't have all the information. We're basically looking at it from the 10,000 feet view, where we have a group of youth who don't use and a group of youth who do use. And when we look at the brains, like they have something called a functional MRI, where we can look at the brains, we see differences. We see volume differences, connections and neural tract differences. And the theory is that when someone's using THC, they're messing up the ways that those synapses are being made. All the decisions that go into impulse control, short-term memory, all those are synapses. And if you're ingesting or inhaling chemicals that are toxic that affect the brain, it's only natural to think that those synapses aren't going to work, right? Or not going to be create as many of those. So whereas someone who's going about their day fully alert, compare that to someone who is flooding their brain with THC, it makes kind of sense where they're going to have short-term memory issues, impulse control issues, and all those things bear out into all these social goals where these kids aren't going to school, they're missing school, and they're not graduating. So I can't answer it as a molecular scientist, as I do not claim to be, but we're looking at it more as the impact, where we compare teenagers who aren't using cannabis to teenagers who are using cannabis. And we do see brain differences when we look at MRIs, and we do see their ability to answer questions and short-term memory. And then real life examples is just that we see that these kids are at higher risks of dropping.
Mm-hmm. So, Gary, when you're talking to kids, might it be wise to say, what have you heard about using cannabis? Because they've obviously heard stuff, and you kind of wonder what information they have in their head.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, with that route, you're talking about the topic. and you're not interrogating. And that's really important. So I would recommend parents, caregivers, teachers, spiritual leaders when they're really talking about with either a group or an individual, just talk about it. Say, I understand that cannabis is being used in some circles of friends. What do you think about it? What do you think the effects are? That'll be a great opportunity where if if someone chimes in and say, "Oh, it's medicinal. It has no, it's completely natural." Then you can retort with, well, actually, it's not natural. It's not natural to put anything in our bodies that we don't need. It's never a good idea to smoke anything. There are maybe some people who use this as a medicine, maybe people who have cancer. But for the average person, no, we don't need this in our bodies, and it can be quite harmful.
Mm-hmm. All right, Gary, I'm going to take a little break. Dr. Gary Kirkilas is my guest. And if you have a question or comment, 877-933-2484. We'll be right back. We carry each other's burdens. Please know you can bring us your prayer concerns and we will pray. Share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio team by texting or calling 877-933-2484 or share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio staff and listeners at myfaithradio.com. My guest is Dr. Gary Kirkilas, and we're discussing cannabis and its legalization, which is in about 24 states right now and probably growing. That's the direction it's headed. And then the impact it has on kids, because kids can get their hands on cannabis gummies, and they look like candy, and they don't act as fast as the other way of getting it into your system, so they can get toxic quickly. A question that came in, Gary, is how do you think God feels about the legality and use of cannabis?
Yeah, so of course, for those who have a faith life, I encourage people to use it. Actually, if I think most faith traditions interpret that God is a creator and has given us our bodies, and we are to be stewards to take care of our bodies. So how do we console that with someone who drinks alcohol excessively, or who smokes cigarettes, or who smokes cannabis? To me, that's not a person who's taking care of their body. And that could be if you have a child that where you talk openly about your faith. That is one component that you can use. That we are supposed to take care of our bodies, and by using substances like this, we're not really being good stewards of our bodies.
Amen. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah.
So when kids find themselves, I have an interest in this, especially because I host a weekend show called Real Recovery, and it's overcoming addiction through drugs and alcohol. And almost every testimony that comes on the show, Gary, I say, when did you have your first introduction to drugs or alcohol? And it's usually 8, 9, 10 years old, and then most often around 12. Where they had access to their big brothers, their big sisters, marijuana. And boy, it starts on a road, and they go down a very dark place.
Yep. Yeah, and it sort of makes sense, because when you're at that age, when you're at the 10, 11, 12 year age range, if you kind of just take all of us are adults, but if you can kind of just try to put yourself in the mindset of a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, you're trying to figure out the world, right? And when someone offers you something and says it's good, you're likely to believe them. You're also really susceptible to peer pressure. No one wants to be the odd man out. You always want to have your tribe. You want to fit in. You don't want to appear weird or abnormal. So when someone offers you something that they themselves are using it, you're more than likely going to say yes, especially if you don't have that solid background and knowledge. You take for example 2 10-year-olds, one whose parent has had really open communication that says, we don't want to put things in our body that are not good for us. We want to take care of our bodies. When that comes around, you've armed that child with the ability to know that when someone's offering them something, it's not good.
Yeah.
Maybe they still use it and experiment, but the thing that they'll have in the back of their mind is that they know what they're doing is wrong, and then they know the expectation is for them not to use it. So maybe they use it once or twice. Hopefully they don't use it all, but they'll at least know. compare that to the child whose parent has never talked to them about the dangers of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what the expectation is. They don't have this idea that these drugs are bad, that they should be taking care of their body. They're more likely to say yes, and they're more likely to experiment. And they don't have that little seed in the back of their mind where they know that they're doing something is wrong. So yeah, absolutely, it makes sense that young people start at this age, because they're more open to things, and a lot of times parents haven't initiated that conversation. And I know that's really tough as a parent. I have 4 kids myself, and I want to preserve their innocence, but at the same time, we do have to arm them to prepare to be people of this world, and not everyone has the same ideas or is looking out for our children.
Mm-hmm. Gary, another question came in. I found out my teen was purchasing 2 grams of vanilla flavored something, which seemed like it was for vaping, but I'm not sure. Is there a way to test to see if a teen is using it? Do you recommend a book that I can use to inform her about the dangers involved?
Yeah, so if you can, take a picture or Google the name of the device. Some popular brands are called Elf Bar. Those are vape devices for nicotine. There's other things called colors. There's a wide variety. The sky's the limit on some of these brands, and whether they are vape device delivery systems for tobacco or for cannabis only. So it's really hard to tell. But yeah, if you find the device that you see, I would take a picture and Google it to see what's inside of it. I will say also that it can be quite difficult because a lot of these manufacturers of vape devices make their vape devices to look like things that you would be very unsuspecting. For example, there are, I'm sure most people are familiar with a highlighter marker, the neon yellows and pinks. There are vape devices that look exactly like those, but they're not highlighter markers. They're actually vape devices. They're also pens that are made to look exactly like that. So it's really hard to even find these things in the first place. Whether they're, as far as other ways to find out, some parents kind of go down the road of drug testing their kids. That's something that has to be approached very sensitively. Once you sort of go down that road, you're essentially saying that I don't trust you. And it's much better if you're at the point where you can try to instill that trust and instill those communications. I do know that later on down the line, maybe those kids are being repetitively secretive, and that might be something that becomes a topic of discussion. I would probably include maybe a counselor in that before you start going down that road to know whether your child is using or not. As far as what books, off the top of my head, I don't have anything off the top of my head. I will say that the American Academy of Pediatrics has a lot of, it's called healthychildren.org. It's a good place to kind of find more information, but I don't have anything off the top of my head as far as a book to recommend.
No worries. Another question, Gary, my son is vaping and he's doing a lot of throwing up. I assume that's related?
Yes. And again, that sort of points to the fact that, again, when you smoke one single cigarette, by the time you were done with that, you were pretty much, you knew what you were doing and you're okay. Just the mouth full of smoke smell would put you at a means where you weren't going to go back to that. Whereas again, with the vaping, nicotine has lots of systemic effects, raises blood pressure, heart rate, etc. And I've gotten a lot of kids who come in with that exact symptom where they're very nauseous, they're throwing up, they're dizzy, lightheaded, and it's because they've, completely inundated their bodies with nicotine because they have these flavors and you don't really know what you're getting yourself into.
And when we talked about gummies, the only other thing we didn't mention, Gary, was edibles, which seem to be like baked goods and candies that kind of look fairly innocent, but they're not.
Yes. So yeah, under the umbrella of edibles would be anything that's not smoked. So gummies would fall into that category, but there's a lot of other things. So they have things like chips with THC components in, pizza. I know there's several dispensaries that will apply for a food license in which all their baked goods, all their foods have some THC component into it. So that you'll have things like chips, French fries, pizzas, burgers, really anything can be put in. And then you have to think about, what do teenagers, what do they crave all the time? Well, they crave, pizza and hamburgers and candy. So they're sort of playing to their audience.
Yeah. Gary, thank you so much. A lot of people on the text line have been very informed by this hour. So I appreciate very much your expertise and your willingness to come on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I hope it's helpful for everyone.
You bet. Dr. Gary Kirkilas has been my guest. We're going to take a break, and then Randy Frazee is going to discuss the death of Jesus in hour 2. That's coming up next. If you are brand new to Faith Radio and you are just kicking the tires and want to know more about us, you can request a free welcome pack. You can do that right now. You can just text the word welcome to 877-933-2484. I know talking about kids using drugs is a pretty sensitive subject, and if you're troubled right now and you need prayer and life can feel a little overwhelming, let us pray for you. You can call or text your requests to the same number, 877-933-2484, or you can visit myfaithradio.com. Thanks again to all the wonderful people in Sioux Falls, South Dakota yesterday that were so gracious for God Talk Live. We had a blast. We'll be right back. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.